humans try, for the most part, to do the right thing. People can end up doing the wrong things, but, their motives, I believe, 99 times out of 100, they're genuinely thinking they can help. Wanting to help and helping are two totally different things often, right? So, when these bodies, say we want to improve human health and global health, some of the things they do, yes, are highly beneficial. Some of the other things they do, when looked in retrospect, you go, that has really misfired, or, that has been damaging. Good question. So I have many hats. I'm a clinician. I also am the research director and founder of a company called Vaccine Proprietary Limited, and I've held professorial positions at various universities over the years. I have at least 3 hats. I'm sure there are more if I think about it, but they would be my major areas, academic research, clinical medicine, and then vaccine development within the sort of company environment. I fell in love with science, and that was the area of discovery of DNA. It just really excited me. So although I went into medicine, and my family are very medical, my mother, my father, my elder sister were all doctors, so you could say that was a natural place for me to go. But I guess if you ask what was my real passion, it was to help people by making scientific discoveries. Some people would say, I'm too passionate about this area of research, but how can you not be passionate about such a powerful tool to improve, disease around the world? As I say, it's hard not to become passionate about the potential for vaccines to transform human disease. And as a clinician myself and doctor, that's what I dream and have been dreaming for a long time, ever since I was a young kid, about doing. Not just treating people, but actually curing their diseases. And I think this is the tool that, as I can see, can be used for that purpose. And as I say, we've seen miraculous results. I mean, again, it takes time to prove that to the rest of the world. But, you take a patient with cancer who has a month or 2 to live, and you can see that cancer completely regressing, sort of disappearing, and they're alive 2 years later and sort of back to normal activities. You only need one of those instances to know you're onto something. To prove it to the rest of the world, they want to see 10 and 20 and 100 and 1,000 and 10,000 examples of those miracles. But as a clinician, you only have to see it for the first time to know you're on a winner. And that can be frustrating, because if you don't get the support to accrue those other examples and to build, scientific publications and prove it to the world, you may know you have the magic formula, and you may never be given an opportunity to actually prove that to the rest of the world, because that takes resources.
I'm joined now from Adelaide by Professor Nikolai Petrovsky.
To understand what's really happening with the COVID crisis in Australia, we have Professor Nikolai Petrovsky.
We here at Republic TV are being joined on this very special broadcast. We have a guest joining us, Nikolai Petrovsky, founder chairman of Australian biotechnology company Vaccine Limited. Welcome, Mr. Petrovsky. Thank you for speaking to Republic TV.
You see something, and to you it's blindingly obvious, the solution. And you see this decades before anyone else. You know, I jumped into artificial intelligence during my PhD, so we're talking 30 years ago, and you know, started to apply it to my research, and I was taken aside by none other than Professor Gus Nossel, who's, you know, world famous, was the director of the Walter and Eliza, and he was aware I was dabbling in these areas, and he said, look, Nick, you know, this, you got to be careful because you won't be seen as a credible scientist if you publicly talk about what you're trying to do with things like artificial intelligence, because that's not what traditional scientists think is the way forward. You know, they think you have to do everything physically, you know, at the laboratory bench. The idea you can simulate, you know, experiments in computers, you know, people will think you're on the edge and you're a bit crazy. So don't necessarily stop doing it, but don't tell anyone about it. I mean, look at AI now, you know, ChatGPT. I mean, you know, we've been trying to tell the world for 30 years we should have been using AI in research all that time. It's incredibly powerful, and it does replace the need for very expensive experiments that you can simulate in a computer. So the trouble was, we tried to get funding, we tried to get support, and sure enough, he was right. It was a closed door, and you know, it was actually seen as a negative. That we were trying to push these boundaries, and particularly in Australia, the science establishment is so conservative. I mean, just outrageously conservative, to the point where they don't even want you to do a novel experiment, because their attitude is, if you don't know the result of the experiment, well, we don't want to support it, it's too risky. I mean, that's the antithesis of science. So I don't have a lot of respect for the science establishment in Australia when they have such sort of conservative, outdated views. And then you'll see them 30 years later jumping onto AI because now it's sexy and everyone accepts it, and trying to now claim that they're experts in the area. And again, pushing aside people like myself who've been doing it for 30 years successfully, but getting no support or recognition. So there are real problems in Australian science. It really needs to be opened up and examined, but it's a closed club, and it's a very conservative, inward-looking club, unfortunately. You know, I'm not getting support in Australia. Maybe the US will be open to these brave new ideas. I was forced to do, you know, take unorthodox paths, and one of those paths was to have the audacity as an unknown player in the field to apply to a US government, you know, grant opportunity after 9/11. To apply some of these creative ideas that I had at the time to developing new vaccines. And you have to remember that 9/11 were the anthrax attacks. You know, George Bush said, well, haven't we got a solution, a vaccine or something? And the NIH, when they looked at it, said, no, the US doesn't have a vaccine industry anymore. It's all moved, you know, offshore because it wasn't profitable. And he said, right, you know, I'm going to allocate several $1 billion to be only spent on vaccine research. So that was 25 years ago, and suffice to say, I've been supported, you know, through those US government mechanisms ever since. You know, they love the idea of applying artificial intelligence to design vaccines faster and better. You know, they love some of our ideas about safer vaccines and vaccines that don't cause you to get sick or you know, don't give you a sore arm. But obviously it's research that's way too cutting edge for the Australian science establishment. I mean, all the ideas I'd been trying to sell in Australia and completely failing were embraced and continue to be embraced to the point where I think, so far we've had over $50 million in funding, which is an extraordinary amount for an Australian scientist based in Australia. I mean, we obviously try to collaborate with US scientists, but that funding is for a group in Australia. Now, normally, governments are very parochial and they only fund science in the country in which they're based. Not surprisingly, that's what Australia does. Doesn't fund anyone outside Australia. The US is largely the same, and they've been funding us for 25 years. To me, that says something. Was very angry, I have to say, about the Australian science establishment and how, blinkered their vision was, and that they couldn't see all the potential in embracing new ideas and pursuing these directions. Now I look back and say, well, I should be so grateful. If they'd given me a few $1,000s, I wouldn't have ever bothered to have the audacity to think as a nobody, in the sense of the US, that I could actually apply and win. I think at the time we're talking $2.5 million was my first ever grant. That was a time Australian grants was, 100,000 was considered a big grant. And here I land as a complete unknown, a $2.5 million grant. It was like equivalent of 10 Australian grants. I mean, I couldn't believe it. But I should be, grateful to those bigoted Australian scientists who were trying to stop me going forward, because they put me in the position where I had that opportunity to land something that they could themselves never have landed. So maybe fate, and I guess I have become a bit fatalistic over the years. I think fate does direct us, and some things that we think of as being major setbacks or barriers or negatives, when we actually look at them in a bigger perspective, we suddenly realise, wow, actually, it felt horrible at the time, but maybe that was one of the best things that ever happened. And again, it's this idea that adversity, we shouldn't just treat it as a negative. It's horrible. I mean, let me say, no one enjoys adversity and being put down and having these terrible negative experiences. But it isn't all negative, and somehow we have to reach inside and look for how that adversity is a part of life, and having people who are bigoted and people who have no insight, isn't all bad. I mean, not that I'm encouraging that sort of behaviour. It would be great if Australian science could be opened up and become more embracing of diversity and cutting edge ideas and pursuing this, and the fact that not everyone has to be a clone of the people who've gone before us. Like, not everyone has to be a clone of Gus Nossel to be a successful scientist. But at the moment, that is the way they think. But maybe that's good in the sense it pushes some of us who are creative not to get trapped in their system, and to be able to criticise their system from the outside, even though they don't like it and they try to do everything to stop it. No system shouldn't have external criticism, because that's again what drives change, what drives improvement. The problem here is we have a system that's designed to prevent any criticism, because again, it's a closed club, and everyone inside is only going to say it's a wonderful club, and their ears are shut to anyone from outside the club, or they'll actually actively try and silence that person to remove their voice. So not even not listen to them, but how can we silence them? How can we blackmail them into being silenced? How can we bribe them into being silenced? How can we destroy them so no one actually takes them seriously? And unfortunately that is going on, and I think during this pandemic we've seen that escalated to the nth degree. It's become amplified, and I think now it's becoming visible to other people from outside the field. Previously, if I talked about this 3 or 4 years ago, people would say, but there's no, that can't be right. There's no evidence. I can't see it happening, because it was invisible. When the way the system was working was a system of control, and anyone who didn't play the game either left the field completely, and I've seen examples of that, or they went overseas and disappeared and found a system like the US where things were more open and never came back again. So there was no one actually here actively seen to be criticising what was clearly a terrible system that wasn't delivering benefits to humankind. It wasn't delivering, big advances in human treatments. It was serving the purposes of the club, which was to play at science and get lots of government money to do that without actually being held accountable to say, how are you helping human health? Yes, you're getting great publications, you're making a great name for yourself, you're pandering to your own egos, but where is the improvements to human health? And as a clinician, that's what really caught in my throat, because whenever you saw great science in Australia, you said, okay, why aren't we moving this into a clinical trial? Why aren't we turning this into a drug? And they said, no, that's not science. No one in science, that's not proper science. And I'm saying, but that's what we should be doing, isn't it? Nick, you don't understand. If we allowed that sort of translational activity to occur, that would diminish science in Australia, because that's what we call commercialisation. That's evil. That's the stuff that drug companies do, and they're trying to make profits, and therefore the idea that a scientist actually takes an invention and turns it into a product, that should never be allowed to happen. And then you think, just wait, I thought medical science in Australia is funded to create products. No, it's funded to support the scientists doing science and pandering to their egos, but it isn't meant to translate to products, because that would change the focus. And as they saw it, and they, I think, continue to see it to this day, that would diminish science in Australia in their view, because it would mean that some people would be successful, they would then get supported, and then the basic science would be sort of forgotten and wouldn't get the attention it does. I mean, crazy ideology, but this is the ideology driving science in Australia to this day, and it really infuriates me that you can't break through and get through to these people, that, if you had some success stories to show, that would drag the rest of science along with it. Don't you get it? I mean, we've just developed the first successful vaccine in Australia in 40 years. 40 years. You hear a lot of stories about amazing vaccine research in Australia. There's not a single vaccine in humans that's been developed in Australia in the last 4 decades. We break that drought, you'll hear nothing about our vaccine. That's, you could say, quite extraordinary. So why don't they want to talk about, breaking a 40-year drought and showing that you can develop? Well, they don't want to admit that it's possible, because they prefer to think it's not possible, that they had shut all the gates to stop that happening, believe it or not, while promising they're going to deliver it, because every grant they write, they'll say, and this will translate to a vaccine against XYZ. But they have no intention of allowing that to ever happen. So when we do it without one of their grants, it's an embarrassment. So they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to acknowledge it. They want to pretend our vaccine doesn't exist. You know, that in itself tells you there's something seriously sick at the heart of Australian science. The function of science is to accrue knowledge. And it shouldn't be corrupted by a desire to turn that knowledge into product. That's something different, and that would corrupt, you know, basic science. Now, so there's an understanding of those people that someone else may come in and translate what I'm doing, but I don't want my science to be corrupted by someone sort of telling me that I can only do it if I can show that it is going to create a product or transform an industry. So they've been very resistant, and Australia is really one of the worst countries and the bastion of this idea that basic science should not be tarnished by any influences from the outside. So no pushing or pulling, no telling me that I can't do this basic science project because it's meaningless, but I have to do this one because that one might translate into, you know, a product. So we have this club in Australia. It's a long-term generational thing where people come into that club by embracing the same philosophy. And so it's almost like I would say it is a religion. So it's what they'd call the religion of basic science. And they are very protective of that religion. And so it's heresy to say science should mainly be done for the purposes of a particular focus, like, you know, improving medicines, improving the energy industry. These people enjoy just doing science, and you know, some of what they do is incredibly esoteric, that most people would look at and say, why are you even doing that? Like, what's the purpose? And they just go, you don't understand. It's my religion. You know, I want to do it, not because it's going to transform anything, but just I think it's an interesting question to me. And it doesn't have to have any practical benefit. Science in Australia is what we call peer-reviewed, which means the club decides what gets funded. And again, that's a horrendous system. Because once you have a club and they have a philosophy, then what they're going to do is, the government gives them this $1 billion or $10 billion, and then they decide who they allocate it to, and they're only going to allocate it to people who are members of the club, who share the identical philosophy. And if that philosophy is, we only support things where, there's no necessarily direct connection to a desire to make a product or to improve human health, then anyone who comes in, as naively I and others come in and say, and demonstrate, we really do intend to translate this to a product, they cut you off at the knees, because they don't believe that should be allowed to happen. So I know it sounds bizarre, because every medical research grant in Australia, at the end, the final paragraph will say, I am going to cure diabetes, I'm going to develop a vaccine for tuberculosis, whatever. But that's just window dressing. That's in case a politician reads it, so that they can then claim, well, okay, all of this research we're supporting has an intention of being translated. The truth is it doesn't. Quite the opposite. That is pure window dressing. That in Australia, the intention is that all the money that is given be distributed on the basis that it supports projects that are not intended, seriously intended, to actually cure human disease, despite claiming to do so. That is the lie that underpins Australian research funding. Why has there been no successful human vaccine in 40 years in Australia, despite tens, hundreds of billions having been paid to support research that claimed to be, vaccine research? The answer is because they deliberately only funded projects that couldn't deliver. And the one project that could deliver it, and we've proved that, it's not just a claim, it's proven, right, they didn't support. And that tells you why Australia doesn't produce medical treatments, why it doesn't produce vaccines, is because they are deliberately not funding anything that credibly will translate to a successful product. I know it sounds bizarre, but that protects basic science. So what they're not thinking, oh, this is terrible. If people knew about this, they would realise this whole thing's a sham that's designed not to translate to treatments, right? They're just thinking this protects basic science, and basic science is our religion, and we have to protect that religion at all costs. They're not thinking about the consequences. If you say, but Australia has had some phenomenal successes in medical research. We discovered Helicobacter as the cause of gastric ulcers, and we can now prevent gastric ulcers by treating, with antibiotics. And they'll all tell you to a man, no, this was never supported by government funding bodies. I just did this off my own bat, or I got funding from overseas or from some unorthodox source. I had met a rich person who said that sounds like a great idea and support. None of it has been supported by the tens of billions of dollars the Australian taxpayer has been pouring into medical research in Australia on the promise, and the false promise by these people, that this research is intended to result in medical cures. That is not its intention, and that's why it hasn't delivered, because it was never built around that. So it was, and they've actively stopped people who they know are determined to translate the research, and like me, they lock them out of the system in the hope that they never move forward. One reason we need a royal commission, straight away into this, is to see how dysfunctional the system is. And dysfunctional systems, when put under pressure, deliver terrible results. And so it's not that the pandemic created this system, which some people believe that this is, it just everything went wrong after No, the pandemic just put a terribly designed system under additional stress and really exposed how bad the system is. But this is a system that goes back decades. It goes back, lifetimes, and it's a system that we have to fix. But we can't fix it if we refuse to even acknowledge its problems. And that's why I believe we do need serious inquiries. We do need royal commissions to really drill down, not just to why did we get mandates when they infringe civil rights and there's no scientific justification, and even WHO, in their guidelines said, mandates are an absolute last resort. This is pre-pandemic. All of that was ignored. So we need to drill down not just into why was all of the previous sort of decisions ignored, why were all our pandemic plans that were in place before the pandemic completely ignored, that would have stopped all of these things happening. Even the masks, the WHO again and all of these bodies had spent 40 years looking at this, had concluded before the pandemic masks don't work for an aerosol transmitted disease such as COVID-19. So why did we have mask mandates when all the science leading up to the pandemic said that wasn't going to have any significant effect? So we have to not just look at why was none of that advice followed, but why was why did the whole system fail us? Why did no one get up who was involved in those earlier guidelines and say this is crazy? Or if they did get up, Why did they have their heads shot off, not just by the media, who are largely ignorant, if we're honest, but by their scientific colleagues, who similarly must have known some of what had been determined before, but had flipped their position for some strange reason, and were now talking or arguing the opposite of what they believed pre-pandemic. How did that happen? The science didn't change. But what happened was the funding changed. Suddenly anyone who got up and said, yeah, mandates are great and masks are great and everything, funnily enough, they all got multi-million-dollar grants into, their university bank accounts, within months of making those media pronouncements. So what we have to realise is humanity is a self-organising system in a context of chaos. It was something, fully planned and coordinated, or, did it just happen by chance? The answer is always, it's a mixture of that in the context of a self-organising system. So certainly some of what we saw happen during this pandemic had been preordained or pre-discussed. There were groups like the Gates Foundation, and other think tanks who over the last, 5 years particularly, had been thinking about pandemics and what should be the response to a pandemic, not just in terms of vaccines, but in terms of psychology of populations. How do we get everyone to behave in the same way? So again, that's public knowledge. They held workshops, they had played scenarios where they had mock pandemics and said, what should we do? And obviously the idea of population control and the idea that we have to frighten people into getting them to all behave the same way, that fear is a massive motivating factor to get people to behave all the same. And the idea of psychological conditioning of the population, of taking control of the media and only allowing one message in the media. I mean, all in their context of a workshop, they all sound perfectly reasonable, rational. If humanity is destroying itself, by using these tools to control humanity, to bring the situation under control, it innately sounds reasonable and the thing to do. But of course, it was a planned or a scenario, an exercise. And when you'd run those exercises, you're never looking at the negative consequences, if that makes sense. You're looking at the positives, like, can we get everyone to behave the same way? No one asks the question, but if we get everyone to behave the same way and we tell them the wrong thing, could that have 100 times worse consequences of having a degree of chaos and different perspectives and views, and having some people going this way and other people going that? That was never considered. What about human rights, and are we setting a precedent where this could be misused, that we could, a government could misinform the population and get them all to behave in a aberrant way using these tools. So I think that when you put it in the context of the exercises, yes, these mind control and behavioural control things were centre stage. And the pandemic, absolutely, they rolled them out on a coordinated fashion through all the governments, you'll notice, of the countries that have participated in these workshops. There are obviously other countries that didn't participate who decided to go in different directions, but by large part the Western countries who were part of these exercises where, you know, Gates Foundation and these other bodies have influence, you know, they all did have a coordinated response. Thinking ahead, realise now how opportunistic groups will come in and exploit, you know, emergency situations for their own benefits. Don't project this, the world is altruistic, and if you look at Australian scientists, they say, oh, during the pandemic, all scientists in Australia came together and worked together. Complete, utter nonsense, right? In truth, it was all knives in the backs, who can grab the most resources, who can get the most media attention, who can get the ear of the government, with the idea of, again, getting more resources. This idea that there was cooperation and everyone, again, it's a fantasy that is painted for the public view. But the reality is the complete and utter opposite. And so what we need, is pre-pandemic plans that say inevitably there will be opportunistic groups. This will include, you know, our leading universities, our leading institutes, who are going to be prepared to basically sell their souls, will even, you know, contradict their own science in the short term to get access to large pools of government money. And therefore, suddenly all the science that they are claiming is not reliable and can't be trusted. And it will be the biggest universities and institutes that will be the biggest culprits. And we saw that. We saw the modelling, all the fake modelling data that was ludicrous. I'm a modeller. I know rubbish data when I see it, but, you know, obviously, you know, the government and, you know, were using that in their media messaging. So, you know, they were getting the results they wanted, that supported the mandates and all the behaviours that were infringing civil rights, were all being supported by fake science, which was coming from Australia's leading universities and institutes. The media has completely failed the population for the last 3 years. Utterly, completely not a dissenting voice. They were the attack dogs of these sort of policy autocrats. And the damage they have done is so massive that it may even be, paradoxically, that even if the media went back to having some integrity, transparency and openness, is anyone actually going to listen to the media anymore? And if they don't, we have a problem. You know, like that's the irony. Even if we fix the media, or the media do find some integrity and independence, if everyone is switched off, you see, I'm just worried we've set the boat or the plane, whatever, on autopilot. And now no one has an opportunity to get into the cockpit to change things. And you know, so we may have destroyed the whole system that kept the system alive. It's a terrifying thought. That, you know, so that it's a bit like people wake up, but, you know, in a totalitarian regime and realise even if we empower people to have a voice again, it won't actually, we can't reverse the system. A bit like communist Russia, I guess, when they realised that the whole system had now been built by them, where they no longer controlled the system. So it didn't matter if they woke up. Didn't matter if you know, they suddenly realised this is dreadful. They had no power to change it. I do have serious concerns that it's not going to be easy, even once the population wake up. Because I think the population have disempowered themselves, the media have disempowered themselves. And, you know, even the politicians have disempowered themselves. So ultimately the people even making the decisions are invisible. We've seen the government has shown we can control the media for any message. So you see a politician go, wow, so we just took total control of the media and we can get them to say whatever we want. Maybe I can change laws that give me powers that I can't be removed, and you have public health experts going, wow, so we can say whatever we want now to the media and they will say that. It doesn't matter whether it's true or false or whatever. And, you know, we can get politicians to enact legislation that give us massive powers forever going forward. Wow. Here's an opportunity. Let's exploit it. And they all did. I think we've got a really hard 10 years ahead of us to reverse the damage. There are people who are awake in society. They're in the minority. And so they have an enormously hard job to do, because they're going to have to work and push and spend the rest of almost their lives trying to fix these problems, to make other people aware, to bring other people on board, to roll back, some of these laws and new ways of doing things, and again, I mean, it's like they're going to have to commit their lives to doing it. And so I think, it will require those few people with insight, to dedicate their lives effectively to one, exposing this, and two, trying to bit by bit, like little incremental bits, get us back to where we were before, and to get the freedoms back. You don't realise you've lost freedom till you've lost it. But if you've allowed yourself to lose it, you may never be able to get it back. This has changed the world, and a large part of the population will be different. Unfortunately, the nature of pandemics is they will keep happening. If we don't fix it, it will be 100 times worse next time. They could be a hell of a lot more severe than this one, and the timing we don't control. It could be, 20 years' time. It could be next week. So we have to fix this problem now, which is why we need a Royal Commission now.